weekly show to share specific knowledge from the staking industry leaders with our community. And of course, this is powered by stakingrewards.com. At Staking Rewards, we are helping investors to navigate the landscape of yield-generating digital assets to find the best opportunities to earn interest on their crypto. My name is Ken Garofalo, and I am extremely excited to welcome today's guest. He was born and raised in France, moved to New York, received a master's in applied mathematics from the New York University in 2007, worked as a research engineer for Google, X and Waymo, got into strategy development and market making while working as a quantitative analyst at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. He published the Tezos Whitepaper in 2014, left his corporate career in 2016 to work full-time on Tezos, which is the first liquid proof of stake protocol ever running in production. Now, since over 2 years already, it's a true pioneer. And Arthur is a true pioneer of proof of stake. So welcome, Arthur Breitman.
Hey, thanks again. I gotta say the bio is not really accurate. So, for the listeners, if you want my bio, you can find it on my website, ex.rs.
Okay, excellent. Guys, head over there for a more accurate bio. And Arthur, just a little icebreaker for you here. So what was the first crypto project that really, spiked your interest outside of BTC and Ethereum, or really outside of Tezos first, and why?
There weren't that many projects, at the time where I was really got interested into it. Bitcoin and Ethereum are early, but early projects I got interested into were Zcash. Before Zcash was even a coin, when it was a zero cash paper. I thought that was quite interesting. I also had some early interest in NXT, which I think was a bit early for its time and doesn't get enough credit. I think it was a pretty cool set of ideas pretty early. Among non coins, I think some of the early exchanges, of course, were interested in what they were bringing, but I remember, like projects that were trying to use cryptocurrencies as opposed to big cryptocurrencies were quite attractive. And I don't remember the name, but I know there were a few stock exchanges that were running on Bitcoin, very, very fly by night, and I love the the aesthetic of that was certainly quite interesting. And so I wish I remembered the names of them. There were two of them, but name escapes at the moment.
Yeah, that's some cool insights there. And so now we're going to get into some more questions regarding proof of stake. That's where we consider you to be having the most expertise, and of course being the pioneer of the first liquid proof of stake protocol. So with the Tezos white paper being written and released by you, LM Goodman, I think, right, in 2014, you've already identified so many problems that required innovations in the crypto space. So when did you first start learning about proof of stake, and did you ever question the rise of proof of stake?
So my interest in proof of stake, I think, probably dates from around 2012, I would say 2013. And, it was mostly reflection around a couple. So my issues was the following with proof of work, that essentially in proof of work, you have to continuously issue new tokens in order to pay for your security. And you don't exactly know how much you should be, paying. And the idea that somehow you can have a cap is a little, I think, fanciful, because at some point when you run out of subsidy, you have to rely on transactions. And I was of the view that, and I still am of the view, that blockchains are eventually going to scale, that block space and transaction space is not going to be very scarce. And that can put you in a space where, at first, as you increase the throughput of blockchains, the amount of transaction fees that can be paid can go up. You have, cheaper transactions, more transaction, total amount goes up. At some point, the supply starts exceeding the demand, and it can actually go down and go towards the cost of actually processing the transaction. And the cost of processing transaction can be quite low. So once you get into the situation, it's hard. You have to kind of enforce artificial scarcity around transactions in order to subsidize your chain. In general, I don't really believe in in transaction tax, and you can view an artificial restriction on transaction as a form of transaction tax. So paying for security with transaction tax didn't seem to make as much sense as inflation, but you don't want to have this high level of inflation that goes with proof of work for a long time. So how can you have security for long term with with inflation as low as possible? And for me, this was proof of stake. So that's how I came to it, essentially, in trying to have something that could be secure in the long run without depending on transaction tax, but also could have minimal inflation. And I don't think you can really do that with proof of work. To your other question, no, I didn't doubt for a second that the future was going to be proof of stake. There was, a ton of research going on, and it was clear from the beginning that proof of stake had different trade-offs than proof of work, and that the parts, the part where proof of work works better than proof of stake were way overemphasized. Like the importance was way overemphasized, and the part where proof of stake actually has advantages over proof of work were way underemphasized. So, I think it's largely come true. I don't think there's any chain today that launches with proof of work. The last that did were, I think, and I may say something stupid. I want to say Nervous, but I'm not sure if Nervous is proof of work. There's one of these which is proof of work, and there was the one with the Lisp smart contract language. Sorry, I'm terrible with names nowadays. Today. So there were a couple. I think Grin also recently launched maybe a couple of years ago with proof of work, and that's been it. Like almost every project now that launches is proof of stake or this proof of space time. But it's almost become a non-starter today to launch a proof of work coin.
Yeah, exactly, and we definitely recognize that trend here at Staking Rewards, and our focus is mainly on proof of stake chains as well, as we see that as the future. So in regards to the architecture of proof of stake, so when Tezos launched liquid proof of stake, there were no lockups or slashing risks for delegators from the beginning, which was very attractive for many. Now, many other projects who have these lockups and slashing risks are working on staking derivatives to address the user experience issue for delegators. So in your opinion, are lockup periods for stakers or delegators a bad design decision from those projects? And why does Tezos have none of those?
So the main Tezos was not the idea of Tezos was not built specifically for delegation, and it's called a delegate. But the main idea behind it is the following: there was a general criticism that if you had proof of stake, your keys would have to be online at all time, right? Early proof of stake model. And it's dangerous. Why would you put your key online at all time? And I was like, well, that's a sensible answer. So rather than put your key online at a time, the idea is say you can have a different key just for signing blocks. So you're going to have your main key and you're going to have your different key. Okay. But then that other key, the one you use for signing blocks, it still needs to have maybe some fund at risk. So a portion of your fund is going to be put at risk. And that's what you're going to use. So if you build a system like this, you immediately have the Tezos system, which is that you could actually put someone else's key, right? You could put someone else's key, and then you're basically renting out to them your delegation, your block creation rights. You receive block creation right by virtue of holding tokens. You rent it out. The thing that was very different in Tezos with Tezos from other staking protocols or designs at the time is that a lot of them focused on saying, in order to receive block creation rights, you need to stake. You need to stake to get block creation rights, and then you get those blocks, and then you create those blocks. And a problem I had with this was, well, let's say there's a block reward, right? If you need to stake to get the block reward, then only those people who stake are going to get the block reward, and everyone else is going to be diluted. So you might end up with a bunch of inflation, or you might force everyone to lock up, and then you can't really use your currency. So that's not a great design. And the idea was to say, we're just going to give the block rewards to everyone. So everyone, just by virtue of holding the currency, whether or not you're staking, you're getting the right to create a block. But in order to exercise it, then you need to stake. So it's not stake and then get block reward, it's get block reward and then stake. But the main reason for this was it was based on the idea of having this fixed block reward, fixed as a percentage of the supply, and you don't want people to be diluted. Now, there's an alternative design to this, which doesn't, which I didn't come up with at the time, but which would work quite well as well, which is to have a reverse auction. So instead, you could say, no. The block rewards are only going to come to people who stake. But how do we avoid diluting? Well, people who stake are going to compete to propose the lowest block reward. So you might decide to say, I want to have 20% of the network staked. Like 20% of the money mass should be staked. And then you say, all right, everyone who wants to stake has to propose how much of a reward they're willing to accept in order to stake. And then and then once they do that, you decide who among them are going to stake. So that way, you get the minimal amount of inflation that's required for securing the system. So in Tezos, the funds which are at risk represent currently probably about 12% of the money mass. So those are the funds that can be slashed. And typically, bakers are going to keep 90% of the block. Are going to keep 10% of their baking reward, and they're going to kick 90% of the baking reward they receive to the delegate. What that tells you is that essentially, people would be getting diluted by about 0.5%. It's less than that because you actually have 20% of the network not staking. But if everyone were staking and the rate was 10%, it would be about 5% a year divided by 10, so about 0.5%. So another way to do it would be to say no delegation. It's just that the block reward is 0.5% a year. Like essentially, what that tells you is 0.5% a year is the amount of inflation that's necessary to pay all the bakers, to pay for all their equipment, and so on and so forth. So that would be another way to do it. So in Tezos, we find the rate that you need to pay to block producers by this agreement between delegates and bakers, where the baker says, I'll keep 10%, you keep 90%. That's how we set it. Another way to do it would have been to do it with an auction on chain. And I think both work. But the point was not to say like, oh, let's create a way for people to stake. One thing I say that staking is boring. And if Tezos could work without staking, that would be even better. If you could secure the system without having any block reward or any of that stuff, that would be better. The point is not to stake. That's that staking is only useful to secure the chain. The point is what you do on the chain once it's secure.
Yeah, fantastic insights there. And it seems like this is the trade-off for the risk of slashing for that fee that the bakers are charging. And it's been proven to be working quite well. From all the user experience that I'm getting for feedback, everyone really likes the delegation function running the bakers. On Tezos, everyone's really pleased with how it's been going. And what do you think, in general, is the main advantage that proof of stake has over proof of work?
I think that I think you get more security for cheaper, essentially. And the reason you get more security for cheaper is that everything is symmetric in proof of work. So in proof of work, one way to think about it is that you're continuously bribing the block producers to be honest. And you're saying, if you're honest, you're getting a reward. If you're not honest, you're not getting a reward. That's essentially it. So the benefit for being honest is the same as a penalty for being dishonest, just opposite sign. In proof of stake, you can have much more of an asymmetry. You can say, look, if you're honest, we'll pay you a little bit. We'll pay you a little bit to compensate for the capital you have to lock up. We'll pay you a little bit for the machine that you have to run. But if you're dishonest, we're going to take a lot of what you have. There's going to be a very, very high cost. And because you can impose a much higher cost for being dishonest than a reward for being honest, you can have a much lower reward. Because you have this asymmetry between the reward and the penalty in proof of stake that you don't have in proof of work. That means you can run proof of stake with much, much lower inflation than you could with proof of work. That's the main advantage of proof of stake. It's better if you want to have sound money.
For sound money, and hence that's what we see the trend for all new projects launching, more so on the proof of stake side, right? So I think it's well recognized by the industry that there's more advantages for proof of stake. And in regards to,
I don't think it's actually recognized that well. I think it's. I think people like proof of stake for a variety of reasons, and they will say, "Oh, it's more environmentally friendly," which might be true as well, or it's just that you don't have to depend on these miners, and you're less sensitive to like 50% attacks. They will mention this, but a lot of people still give lip service to this idea popular in Bitcoin circle that somehow proof of work is better for money. It's kind of like oftentimes unchallenged, even though it's actually where proof of stake really shines. So I don't think it's quite acknowledged, and a lot of people launching proof of stake platforms, they don't even want to think of it as money. They're like, no, we're an application platform. This is not about being a pet rock or a cryptocurrency. And I say quite the opposite. If you want to be a hard asset, you're better off with proof of stakes than proof of work. I mean, you're better off being an incumbent. If you want to be a hard asset, you're better off launching 10 years ago. That attributing the benefits, attributing like Bitcoin success to proof of work as opposed to being an incumbent is ridiculous. But being an incumbent is like the most important thing of all, more than being proof of stake or proof of work. But if you hold everything equal, I think you're better off with proof of stake.
And maybe some of those old arguments have to do with a little bit of tribalism that still exists, or maximalism within those communities. So
I think that a lot of Bitcoin, even before there were much competition, Bitcoin was attacked very early on a lot for the proof of work because for lack of elegance, energy cost, and so on and so forth. And it used to be that if you wanted to defend cryptocurrencies at all, you had to defend proof of work. So defending Bitcoin was defending proof of work. And so I think it became a big part of the culture that somehow like, don't attack proof of work. Proof of work is fine. And so there's kind of like this reflex of looking down on proof of stake, even though it has all these benefits.
Absolutely. And getting into, I guess this is a question on decentralization. What we've seen in the past, we've seen hostile takeovers happen with the Steam blockchain, for instance, where tokens were custodied on Binance, Huobi, Polynex, and something happened where it ousted all validators on the Steam blockchain. Are you concerned this could happen on Tezos, with Coinbase, Kraken, and Binance already owning up to 28% of voting power and rising?
So there's a big difference between chains like Steam, which use and this caused a tremendous amount of confusion, but there is a proof of stake type of algorithm that was developed by Dan Larimer for his successive projects, including BitShares, Steam, EOS, and a bunch of others, that he called DPoS, delegated proof of stake. And whenever you have a form of delegation in proof of stake, people will say it's DPoS. So I hear like, oh, Tezos is DPoS because there's delegation in proof of stake. But then they jump from that conclusion and say like, so it's like DPoS. But the DPoS designed by Larimer has like it's something very, very specific, and the idea is that you have a list of people who wants to be validators, and then people vote for who they want to be a validator, and then you take the top 100 or the top 20, and they become the validators. So the alleged benefit of doing that is it says, look, you're better off having 20 validators who each have 5% of the network, right, than having 1,000 validators where the top 3 have 30% of the network. And that's absolutely true. What matters is not the number of validators, it's how many validators it takes to get to like 30%, 40%, 50%. Now, that's true. The problem is that there's absolutely nothing that guarantees that protects us against Sybil attacks. There's nothing that prevents, one validator for, creating 50 different slots under 50 different names and then being voted. And that's what happened on a chain like Lists, for example, or a bunch of others. You end up with in almost like a two-party system with people voting. And there's also the fact that if you're smaller, you can't participate. So in Tezos, there may be delegation, but there's not this threshold effect, and it's actually proportional to the amount of delegation that you get. So I think that makes a huge difference in how these things can be taken over. And we've seen it in practice. There's been a lot of collusion in things like Larimer's DPoS because there's incentive for it. In Tezos, there's a careful design to make sure there's no incentive for bakers to merge, and there's no incentive for them to Sybil either. And that's very important to maintain, and it's so easy to lose it. If you take a look, for example, at Solana, they have I don't know if it's a website from the Solana Foundation, but they have this website showing validators, and they will show you a list of validators ranked by stake, and then they mark the 1/3 line, and they say, if you want to help decentralize the network, you need to to delegate to the people like below this line, because it increases like decentralization. And you look at this and you said at first, well, that's a great idea. Yeah, we should tell people to do that. Then delegate to smaller ones. The problem is that the minute you've done this, you've created an incentive for Sybil attacks. Because now, if I'm a validator of this network, I have an incentive to say like, oh shit, I want people to delegate to me, so I want to be below the line. Because I want to be below the line, I have an interest in splitting myself into two operations. So it's, and to some extent, I think people who delegate might be able to detect Sybils, but it's not that easy. And I think it's better to not create any. And every single time I hear in this ecosystem of like, let's do an airdrop where we do like, like every baker gets the same amount. Like, no, because you don't know who a baker is and you're creating incentives for bakers to split their stake. Don't do that. It's or like, oh, we should help, like do something that helps the smaller bakers. Like, no, it's not. This is, I've seen proposals like, let's raise the reward for smaller bakers. And that is like the worst fucking idea. I mean, it's just, you have a system that's linear. You don't want to mess with that. You really don't want to mess with that. So to your question, am I concerned? Yeah, it's potential. I mean, so far, what we've seen from large exchanges is not like a desire to take over. It's the opposite. It's more of like, oh no, I have to take part in governance. Can I avoid to do this? Exchanges have a lot of things to deal with, and I think in general they'd rather not be involved in governance than be involved in governance. The one that's the most involved is Kraken, who chooses to vote abstain, which is more than any of the other. We're like, no, that's voting abstain is just too much of a commitment. Please leave us out of it. And I get why they're doing it. It's because of the environment that they evolve in, and so I think they're being conservative. But I get that. There's also, there's simply the fact that the main risk for these players, especially like large exchanges, it's not a tax, right? You're not going to have Coinbase and Kraken and Binance decide to do a 50% attack on the network. It's just, because that's a form of fraud. They are very well-known entities. They're not going to do that. The main risk is the risk of censorship, right? The main risk is that they say, we don't like this upgrade, and we're going to keep voting against it because, maybe we're being pressured in voting against it. It is very, very different to pressure someone into not doing something and to pressure them into doing something. It's one thing for these exchanges to get pressures to, not validate, for example, not participate. Very, very different to tell them to take a positive action to actually like vote against something or vote for something. So I'm not overly worried about it.
Yeah, and it is interesting. Hopefully some of those exchanges are listening today and can at least, do us the courtesy of voting abstain instead of missing all their blocks and just not participating at all. So next question here is, so why do you think it is that many people in the industry still question proof of stake? Kind of like you mentioned before, maybe you said some people still question it. Is the ignorance in comfort, or is there still major hurdles that the development of proof of stake needs to overcome? And which challenges do you think we may face for the proof of stake industry?
So I missed a little bit the very beginning of the question. Can you just repeat the first few words?
Yeah. So what do you think it is that many people in the industry still question about proof of stake?
So it depends who in the industry, right? And there's some people you're never going to win over, right? So if you look at hardcore Bitcoin maximalists, proof of work maximalists, you can talk to them about proof of stake, but why? It's not that relevant. You want to convince people at the margin, not like the staunchest opponent of proof of stake. I think a lot of it comes from propaganda, essentially. So there was a time where people would say proof of stake is like perpetual motion. It doesn't work. It's impossible. We've proved that it's impossible. And what that refers to is there's a thought experiment around proof of stake, which is that you launch a chain in parallel to proof of stake. Let's say the values of the proof of stake chain in parallel run a fake chain, and it costs them nothing because it's not costly to produce block, right? And then a naive user joins the network for the first time, and he sees a real chain and he sees a fake chain, and he cannot tell the difference between the two. And therefore you can't, you can fool new users, and therefore you require trust, and therefore it doesn't work. So it's like proof of, and the idea that it's kind of like, it's like perpetual motion is because, well, in order to secure your system, you need to know what the stakes are. But in order to know what the stakes are, your system must be secure. So it's like it's circular. It can't work. And yeah, so you do lose the property of proof of work, which is that if you get a very, very long chain, you can't tell. You can't tell without like some external indication. But the idea that it somehow invalidates the whole thing is ridiculous. So first of all, you could get, all you need might be to have a data point of like what was a chain of months ago. And there's a ton of transactions on the chain, and every single person using the chain signed a transaction. Also, if you want to be money, let's say you're accepted as money, what branch should I use? Well, when you make a purchase, the vendor knows what branch to use. If I want to go and purchase a car with a cryptocurrency, it's like, oh, but which branch is the real one? Well, the one that the vendor accepts. So it's kind of like it's this property which is really needs to have in proof of work, and you don't have in proof of stake. And this, the real question is like, do we care about this property? And it turns out that this property is like, it's cool, but it's not really fundamental. It's not a very important property of the system. Other property, like if the government cracks down on block production, can I easily move my stake? Yes. Can I easily move my ASICs? No. That is way more important than the theoretical problem of saying I'm a naive user and I just connect to the network for the first time. So the latter one is angel on pinhead territory, and you solve a lot of problems that cannot be solved with proof of. So you might as well say, well, proof of work is impossible because in proof of work you cannot punish bad behavior more than you can reward good behavior. Therefore, no, yeah, there's some properties you can get in proof of stake, there's some properties you can't get in proof of work. So the propaganda that it's impossible is somehow still stuck. Also, nothing at stake problem, all these things. It was very, very effective. The other idea that that comes around is like, oh, it's just replicating the banking system. No, so there's no freedom of entry in the thing that there's basically two visions of the financial industry that people have in this space, and one is that it's this coterie of like wealthy players, and these wealthy players are basically building a club for themselves, and they're like kicking everyone out, and the other version is that this is highly regulated, this is highly constrained, and you need a license for absolutely everything. It's like extremely permission environment. And one may be feeding a little bit into the other, but I think the second vision is far more correct than the first one. And this idea that the main difference is freedom of entry. Anyone can come in and write a smart contract on a blockchain. You cannot as easily do that in traditional finance. So that's one of the main differences. So there's a bit of a egalitarian streak, which I think is misplaced, and I do think there's some problems in traditional finance, and they do not come from it's not a question of money, it's a question of power, and I don't think that there's a tremendous amount of power of the financial industry or politics. I think it's the opposite.
Interesting. It is interesting to think of. And in regards to Bitcoin now, so do you think Bitcoin will ever change its proof of work implementation or improve it radically? Looking wide into the future, could there even be a point where Bitcoiners would push to switch to proof of stake?
I mean, everything's possible, right? It seems unlikely because it's just become such a big part of the culture and such a big part of the brand that I don't see it happening. At some point I did, maybe like 10 years ago. But I haven't thought it possible for a very long time.
Right. Sort of, it's with the brand now, right? So it's not going to change, right?
Yeah.
Something more specific to what we have coming up in the next few days here, liquidity baking. It's going live in about 2 months or so, right? So can you explain a little bit?
11 days.
Few days. Yeah.
11 days.
11 days. So can you explain a little bit about what liquidity baking is in a few words? What do you think will be the implications of that on the overall network and ecosystem? And do you think that these implications on proof of stake security will be impacted? And will there be a competition to make the network less secure now?
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about liquidity baking. So the idea of liquidity baking is that you add a little bit, you create what is called a constant function market maker on the chain. So the most popular one is Uniswap, and it's based on the idea that I have two assets A and B, and I'm going to try to maintain the product A times B constant and charge a fee. That's been has been a very, very popular model. So you create a contract like this on the Tezos chain, and you do it between Tez and between another asset, typically one which might be very liquid. So in this case, in this implementation, the way that was retained was one called TZBTC, which is a wrapped Bitcoin, and it's wrapped by a set of custodians. So you create a market like this, and then you subsidize it by adding at every block a little bit of Tez. You add a little bit of Tez inside of the contract at every block, so that when you provide liquidity in this contract, you get rewarded by Tez. So you get rewarded by fees, but you also get some Tez for doing it. And if the idea is this, and this is primarily an experiment because the amount is quite small. If it's over a period of 6 months, and the total amount of reward would amount to a 0.15% expansion of the Tezos supply. So you're talking about 0.15% compared to the variation of like the crypto market. This is a blip, but it can have an interesting effect. Because it can bring a lot of liquidity. One definition of money is that it's the most liquid medium of exchange. And so having this decentralized mechanism of promoting the liquidity is, I think, quite interesting to observe. And it's been done for other projects, but not for L1s. It's been done generally as a mean of distribution, more so than actual promotion of liquidity. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in terms of the proof of work, the proof of stake security. Essentially, what secures the chain is the bakers and the bonds which are at stake. So that doesn't change. The amount of bonds that need to be placed are going to be pretty much the same. So what changes is a total inflation. So there's a little bit of inflation. So there's a little bit of a cost. So it's not like you're saying we're going to take away from the security budget and use that for baking. What you're saying is like, no, we're going to inflate a little bit more, in this case by 0.15% over 6 months, and use that to pay for something. So, and paying for public goods with a little bit of inflation is something that was part of the original Tezos position paper, and is one of the value of the project. So the ability to do that is, I think, quite unique in chains which have governance. If we didn't have governance, it would be much, much harder to do this.
Okay, so if I'm right here, there's still a bond required for the liquidity baking that's taking place? No.
In liquidity baking, you basically, the idea of liquidity baking is it's just like name baking because it's there's liquidity mining, but it doesn't have anything to do with block production or bonds. What you do is that you provide liquidity in a CFMM contract, a Uniswap-like contract, essentially.
Okay, so I think that's going to be definitely more incentives for people that are chasing yield, right, to lock their liquidity up and benefit from this additional 0.15% inflation. So that's hugely...
and of course there's risk that comes with it because in general, if you have a position as a liquidity provider in this, you can be adversely selected. So these things can be very volatile. Maybe Bitcoin moves against Tez or vice versa, and then people are going to trade against you on the chain. So and I hate the word, but people have referred to this as impermanent loss. In market making, it's generally called just toxicity or adverse selection. But it's there's a cost and there's a reward, which is both the subsidy and the fees. And so at some point it should equilibrate, so that's the reward equilibrates with the cost.
Yeah, very exciting, and I'm sure we'll be putting out some kind of tutorial or research report on liquidity baking once it goes live. So stay tuned, guys, for that. Arthur, it's been amazing talking to you today. It's been great catching up with you. It's been too long, my friend.
Likewise, Thank you.
Yeah. And how can people follow up with you or learn more about the stuff you're working on?
Follow me on Twitter at ARTHURB on Twitter. And I generally post the type of things that I'm doing, and I also retweet a lot of the projects from the Tezos ecosystem. So in general, if you follow me, you'll get a good handle on what's going on.
Excellent. Go check out Arthur on Twitter, guys, and be sure to check out previous episodes of Staking Mondays. We've had interviews with Tor Bear from Secret Network, Do Kwon from Terra Money, Zaki Mania from Cosmos, Stani from Aave, and stay tuned for next week's episode with Kwa Wang from DeFi Alliance. So please, guys, be sure to smash that like button here, subscribe to our channel, and as always, happy staking.
Thank you.
Take care.